In December 2020, the last 300 sheep are removed from 12 fields in Perthshire. But that was only the beginning. The owners of the estate, Paul and Louise Ramsey, do something even stranger. They decide to tear down every fence and never again control where the animals graze, with no grazing plan, no rotation. To their neighbors, it looked like suicide. But just 1 year later, a BBC film crew could hardly believe their own eyes. Where there had once been pasture, a young forest was growing on its own. Then something happened that no one expected. Beavers appeared where they weren't supposed to exist. Their dams cleaned the local streams so effectively that scientists called the water the cleanest it had been in decades. So how did the couple pull it off? Banff is an upland farm on the edge of the Scottish Highlands. 530 hectares of farmland, forest, wetland, and hills, owned by the Ramsey family for 8 centuries already. Roughly a third of that territory is woodland. Paul and Louise Ramsey took over the estate 40 years ago. At that time, the farm grew barley on 130 acres, while the rest of the land went to cattle and sheep. Part of the hills stood under monoculture plantations of Norway spruce dating from the mid-20th century. Paul held a master's degree in ecological conservation before he ever took on the farm. This was no incidental detail of his biography. It shaped the next 40 years. At first, he began replacing the old conifer plantations with native trees. Then he blocked 18th and 19th century drainage ditches in several fields, trying to return the boggy lowlands to their natural state. It was slow, manual work with no guarantees. A spade, a sapling, a few meters of ditch at a time. In parallel, the country was recording a crisis of its own. The 2019 State of Nature report showed that biodiversity in Scotland was declining faster than anywhere else in Britain. The cause was the very same land Paul Ramsey was trying to heal. Fences had divided the territory into 12 isolated fields, making the natural movement of wild animals impossible. Sheep farming on marginal upland pastures brought ever smaller returns, while the costs of maintaining the flock stayed constant. The question facing the family was concrete: what to do with a farm that no longer paid its way as it once had, and that sat, at the same time, in a region with some of the worst biodiversity figures in the country. To sell the land would mean passing the problem on. To continue sheep farming would mean propping up a system that had exhausted itself economically. And they chose an entirely different path. The first attempt with a keystone species had failed long before the official project. According to Sophie Ramsey, her father had wanted to bring beavers back to the land from the very start of his work. He fenced off a patch of wetland and brought in 2 animals from Norway. Both died for different reasons. The next attempt was made with beavers from Bavaria. This time they took hold. In parallel and quite separately from these private attempts, in 2001 wild beavers escaped from an enclosure at Auchingarreach and settled of their own accord in the wider catchment of the River Tay. No one released them there, and the Ramseys made no attempt to recapture them. By 2002, Banff had combined both stories into one and declared the first official demonstration project for beaver reintroduction in Britain. That same year, wild boar were brought onto the land. They were meant to root up the soil with their tusks and snouts, preparing a seed bed for the forest. The boar proved too unpredictable to keep within fences, and over the years, the estate replaced them with the traditional Tamworth pig breed, which performs the same function but can be controlled. These 2 lessons, the beavers and the pigs, lay apart from one another for more than 15 years. The beavers remained an almost accidental experiment on a few ponds. The Tamworths were a substitute for feed on one small patch. No one had gathered it all into a strategy for the whole estate. Paul Ramsey went on planting trees and blocking ditches by hand, field by field, as he had done since the 90s. But everything changed in 2018 when Sophie Ramsey came home to lead the next stage of her father's work. She took the scattered experiments with beavers and boar and began to shape them into a single plan. Not to heal the farm piece by piece over decades, but to lift the agricultural pressure from the entire southern third of the estate at once. This plan turned out to be more radical than simply taking the sheep out of 12 fields. It called for removing, in time, all the estate's internal fences, nearly 5 kilometers of them, and never again deciding for the animals where and when they should graze. Every animal chooses for itself where to go, into the forest, onto the bog, to the stream. The plan acquired a firm date in December 2020 when the sheep left the 12 fields. But to turn empty fields into something more required money, and this is where the action began. In the spring of 2021, on the eve of the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, the family launched a crowdfunding campaign. A perimeter fence with cattle grids, gates for wild animals, the purchase of livestock, payment for ecological monitoring, tree planting, all of it required money that state support for such a holistic approach barely provides for. The campaign's target was at least £24,000. Within 2 weeks, it had raised more than 80% of that sum, and over the following month, it exceeded every projection. The money went towards the first round of interventions in a clear sequence. First, platforms for ospreys and nest boxes for barn owls, then the construction of the perimeter fence, the sowing of yellow rattle, and the digging of ponds and shallows. That same year, Banff Wildland joined the European Rewilding Network, a network that at the time brought together 71 projects from 27 countries. That same year, a film crew from Silverback Films came to Banff. The footage would go into David Attenborough's documentary series Wild Isles for the BBC. The beaver episode would only air 2 years later, on the 2nd of April 2023. But by late November, something unexpectedly terrible happened. Storm Arwen brought gusts of up to 120 miles per hour out of the north, and something unexpected and destructive took place. Taybridge Wood on the Banff estate changed overnight. Countless spruces fell, leaving tiers in the canopy where a solid wall of conifer had once stood. Over the following months, more storms came, and they felled still more trees. It was precisely the mid-century conifer monoculture that fell, the very one Paul Ramsey had spent decades trying to replace by hand. In a single night, the storm opened the soil to the sun in places where not a single ray had broken through before, something that would have taken a person with a spade years. The land came out of winter no longer what it had been before November. Part of the former sheep field still stood fallow. Until then, roe deer had grazed here alone, and there had been no one else, while part of the woodland gained gaps in its canopy for the first time in half a century, letting light through. It was onto this altered territory that a few months later, in March 2022, the first large herbivores arrived. The difference between cattle and sheep is fundamental. A sheep chooses the tender grass and crops it to the root along an even front, creating a uniform lawn. Cattle tear unevenly, taking coarse grass, thistle, young shoots without discrimination. They leave gaps of varying height where flowers and legumes move in. At a comparable project at Canepp in England, the same breed of pig had already shown a concrete, documented effect. Their rooting exposes soil that solitary bees colonize, while the overturned clods of earth kickstart the formation of anthills, a food source for green woodpeckers. Whether this chain will repeat at Banff remains to be seen through further monitoring. For now, it is an expectation built on someone else's precedent, not a result of their own. A separate study of invertebrates on plots with Tamworth rooting adds a caveat. Immediately after the pigs turn over the soil, the overall number of invertebrates falls, ants especially, though the beetle population, by contrast, rises. Only after a year or two, when grazing on the plot ceases, do invertebrate numbers recover and then exceed the control figures. The effect of rooting is not immediately positive, it becomes so only over time. Then came August 2022. 2 osprey nesting platforms were installed on the territory. The following spring, a pair of birds landed on one of them, a species that returns of its own accord, responding only to the infrastructure created, with no animals brought in or released by people. Around that time, Sophie Ramsey launched a new riverbank restoration project, Graze of Alethe, Wild Cores and Corridors. On the same day, the documentary film Riverwoods about Scottish beavers was screened at the estate, followed by a discussion with researchers of river systems. In January 2024, 11 Exmoor ponies arrived from Cochno Farm near Glasgow, thanks to researcher Debbie Davey, who has studied the breed since the 1980s and is completing a dissertation on the role of Exmoor ponies in rewilding. Their role differs from that of the pigs and cattle. The ponies eat coarse, unappealing vegetation, reeds, thistles, and old grass that other animals pass over. By clearing the coarse grass, they allow flowers to grow without competition, and the marks of their hooves create micro-hollows where seed can settle. A few months later, the wild herd's 4th foal was born. It was named Argati, and the event was live-streamed to those watching. Breeding without human intervention is the first sign that the herd has established itself as a self-sustaining population. And in June, a camera trap by a beaver dam captured a pine marten with prey in its jaws. That same month, the same camera filmed a beaver carrying its newborn kit in its mouth. This was only the beginning. Researchers at the University of Stirling published the results of a 2-year analysis of water samples from a stream at Bamouth, above and below the dams, at the inflow and outflow of the ponds, across different seasons. The conclusion: the dams and ponds reduce peak concentrations of pollutants by 95%, including a reduction in the transport and concentration of E. coli. That same month, the main sections of internal fencing were at last removed on the territory. In the fields of Region 2, the fences were taken down completely, opening a passage between woodland and pasture. In Region 1, sections were merged, eliminating the bottlenecks that caused excessive soil damage and slowed recovery. This created one continuous space and opened access to the beaver floodplain areas previously unreachable by the grazing herds. For the first time, the herds passed through these areas, including shallows that a fence had once blocked off. Today, the fenced wild territory is home to 20 head of cattle, 3 pigs, and 11 ponies. The roe deer, which lived here long before the project, remain outside this scheme. At low density, they create small local disturbances in the understory, but the same species is capable of eating a young oak before it rises above knee height, a balance that depends entirely on population density, and one the team tracks just as closely as it tracks the density of the ponies. 3 beaver families have built around 60 dams and ponds across the estate, along with the fallen and submerged trees and woody debris in the water that go with them. The total number of dams across the whole territory exceeds 50 over more than 20 years. The effect of such dams on water is well documented for the species in general, not just at Banff. Sequences of dams reduce the peak flow of floods with a 2-year return period by 14%. Removing such a sequence, in another documented case, led to an 81% increase in flow velocity. This is not a measurement at Bamouth specifically. It is the general scientific consensus on a mechanism that has been at work at Bamouth for more than 2 decades. The February 2025 removal of fencing took away nearly 5 kilometers of fences that had once divided the land into 12 separate fields. On the freed territory, 1 kilogram of wildflower seed donated by Bug Life and Scotia Seeds was sown. In one fenced plot, the Seed Island, 100 native trees were planted. Aspen, wild cherry, oak, hazel, blackthorn, and hawthorn. chosen to improve the age structure of the woodland and to protect the young saplings from beaver activity until they grow strong. Separately from the grant-funded fence removal, the team planted hedgerows of thorny shrubs and trees along the watercourses, as well as large areas of wildflowers, to link up biological corridors and improve nesting conditions for vulnerable species such as the lapwing and the curlew. Boxes for bats and hibernation sites for bats, hedgehogs, and amphibians were installed on the territory. Free grazing without rotation also created a purely operational problem the team is still solving. Animals that no one keeps penned approach people unpredictably. The Tamworth pigs can behave assertively and come up to visitors. The ponies, too, sometimes approach. Both species are capable of biting and kicking, so the estate introduced simple but firm rules for guests. Do not approach the animals, never feed them, keep dogs on a lead, and limit vehicle speed on the estate roads to 15 miles per hour. This is no minor detail. It is the price of the freedom the animals gained. People had to constrain their own behavior, not the animals. On the territory today, one finds roe deer, occasionally fallow and red deer, hares, rabbits, foxes, badgers, stoats, weasels, polecats, pine martens, red squirrels, otters, water voles, beavers, hedgehogs, mice, shrews, and field voles, and possibly wildcats. Ecotourism, conceived as a source of funding, turned out to create jobs unconnected to sheep farming, cleaners, gardeners, and local craftspeople, while the estate rents out accommodation and heats its buildings with wood chip and its own wind turbine. Short internal trails now let visitors see roe deer, squirrels, and, if they're lucky, a pine marten or an otter by the water. But the model still depends on grants, crowdfunding, and ecotourism. Systematic state funding for such a holistic approach did not exist in 2021 and does not exist now. Scaling it to other farms runs up against not a lack of effectiveness, but a lack of any financial mechanism to sustain it beyond a single owner able to plan on a 10-year horizon. And there is a sharper contradiction still. Beyond the estate, the same beaver population that began with the unofficial release of the early 2000s floods arable land and damages the banks and drainage of neighboring farms. Over the past 3 years, farmers have shot more than 300 beavers under license. The conservation group Trees for Life took NatureScott to court, and in October 2021, the agency began permitting relocation instead of shooting, but the shift is slow, and dozens of animals are still killed each year. So BAMFF demonstrates that beavers can purify water and slow soil erosion. A few kilometers away, the same species remains an animal that farmers legally kill by the hundred every year.